The beauty about skateboarding is that like it teaches you about failure, right? A lot of people, once they fail the first time, they kind of quit. And like skateboarding, it's like you try one trick for like 100, 200 times, 300 times, right? Just to get that one time that you make it, you know? And it's like you kind of develop this philosophy of
a piece of wood with wheels. Designer Jon Warren isn't alone when he looks at the way that skateboarding shaped his life. It provided him new ways of interacting and viewing the world around him. Jon looked to skating because it wasn't like team sports and it wasn't all about competition. Your own relentless effort is the only thing that separates you from learning a new trick or from that feeling of accomplishment. But skateboarding has been through a bumpy ride. The commercial success is a far cry from its humble beginnings. The same humble beginnings that spoke to Jon. In the early days, it went from an interesting and curious act to a dark period of retreat. The multi-million-dollar industry that we now know has people like Jon Warren to thank. But Jon never crafted a particular path towards a career tied to skateboarding. He didn't have a game plan, but he did have an open mind. Every step of the way, he allowed himself to soak in the experiences and apply himself through what he had learned. Jon's grandpa served as a printmaker for the likes of Playboy, Time, and other popular publications of the era. He instilled a sense of experimentation and constant improvement in Jon. This openness to new opportunities led him to help the friends around him, but it would pay off. Every new step came with newfound accomplishments, including an illustrious career at Vans. Now, Jon is at Canadian luggage label Herschel Supply Co. Designing bags is a continued extension of Jon's life philosophy. It's something rooted in authenticity and actually embracing failure. Because you see, skating was never about effortless perfection for Jon. Skills learned skating just so happened to translate in everything. Jon met with us on a gloomy weekend amongst his family. Our conversation began with Jon's first introduction to California culture after relocating with his mom and stepdad.
So a lot of the kids had pre-existing like friendships. So for me, like I really had a hard time kind of fitting in because I didn't really know anybody, but all the kids in my neighborhood, they all skated. And so like, and they all went to different schools. So for me, like that was my introduction to like Southern California and like skateboarding, right. Like, you know.
Two kids were particularly influential to Jon. He remembers what they were wearing like it was yesterday. The honest advice was something that Jon really took to heart. And it's crazy to think that now, many years later, that one interaction would define Jon's path for years to come.
Names are relevant, but these kids, they rolled up and they were like, one kid was on a skateboard and one kid was on a BMX bike, and they were like wearing like army fatigues, and they had like all these like heavy metal patches, and you know they had like, you know, t-shirt, you know, like they took like an old t-shirt and sewed it on the back, and they were like man, what's up with what you're wearing? And I was like, I was probably wearing like Dockers and some like boat shoes or whatever, and they're like, I'm like, oh, I'm from Chicago, and they're like, yeah, man, you got to get with it. You got to say, dude, like, you got to get a skateboard, you know, and dude, oddly enough, they said I had to go get some Vans. So like, I talked to my mom about it.
Jon was fortunate to enjoy skateboarding at its peak in the 80s.
This is a street contest, and people are supposed to be spontaneous here, but they're not spontaneous here. Now, let's put up another one and have a half-pipe contest. It'll be more fun, and watch Christian do high backside airs.
And now, please welcome, from around the globe, the greatest skaters in the world. This is the Savannah Slammer.
Nobody should worry about what lines they're going to do. They should just skate. Crowds don't know anything. They do a frontside slide and roll.
Tony Hawk. The 180 ollie, and he does make that all the way. Dropping in. Christian Hosoi.
Names like Christian Hosoi, Tony Hawk, and contests like Savannah Slammer propelled skating. But once the 90s rolled in, many skaters stopped.
And all of a sudden it was like, it started getting into the 90s, and I kept skateboarding, and like a lot of the kids that I grew up with just started fading out of skateboarding. And for me, like, I started making friends and like, reading Thrasher magazine, and like the thing with like Thrasher magazine was just at the time, no internet. It was like our gateway to like learning how, like what was going on in New York, what was going on in Paris, like what was going on in South America. And like, you just read it from like page to page. And like,
when skateboarding died, Jon says that it actually got better. It embodied an intense passion. After all, nobody was doing it because it was cool. And for those that maintained interest in skating, publications like Thrasher magazine cross-pollinated different cultures.
I'm gonna tell you what time it is. Yo, it's time for me to pump up the volume. My girl told me just the other day, show my boys street pads forward.
It wouldn't be surprising to see seminal punk band JFA alongside hip-hop heavyweights Ice-T and KRS-One. Taking different worlds and combining them was natural. To touch back on the topic of passion, Jon's friends ran a skate shop called Resolution that essentially catered to themselves. Through the downturn, it was the strength and passion that sustained them and led them on to an interesting creative path.
anyway, so like when I was working at the skate shop, the big thing for me was just like over and over again, it would be like, hey, we need some store signs. And I'd be like, oh, they're like, you're creative. And I'd be like, I don't, okay.
You're creative, you can do it.
So like, we started learning about printmaking, and then like, we'd go to like, we'd had friends that worked at Kinko's, and so we started making like skateboards and like little like skateboard magazines, and so doing zines, and then we'd write like bands that we'd like, and like do interviews like by like dude, we'd send them a letter.
They'd just design their own flyers, they'd print their own zines and interview bands through snail mail. It forced them to really learn on their own at a time when resources were scarce. There weren't a ton of case studies or online tutorials to go around. Few people were doing it, and even less people sharing their skills with others.
Well, yeah, because like realistically, there wasn't any like this industry of like action sports or streetwear or any of that stuff. Like that, there was no business.
Right.
Like there was that. Like when we were doing this,
It wasn't really
like,
a thing, right?
There was nothing. Like I remember.
Friends like skate pro Jeff Grasso made a meager $400 a month at their peak. It was an indication that skating wasn't really an industry. You either did it out of love or you left.
There was no business. Like there was that. Like when we were doing this,
It wasn't really
like,
a thing, right?
There was nothing. Like I remember like I was talking to like Jeff Grasso about like that time period, and he was telling me that like his paycheck was $400 a month as a pro skateboarder, and that was like at the top of his game.
For the remaining few, road trips were great bonding and learning experiences. You'd pack your board and you'd venture off into new cities, and the clothes you wore served as a cultural identifier.
Looking back on it now, it's like, the skateboarding, the clothing that you wore, like kind of defined the culture, right? So like you'd see another kid and you'd be like, oh, you skateboard.
Right.
Like, okay, what are we doing tonight?
You
Like,
like
what's
recognize-
happening?
yeah.
And so it was like a cultural identifier, you know what I mean? So you instantly were like, okay, like what's happening in the city? Like, oh, dude, let's hang out. And it was just a different time because,
Skateboarding also occurred at a time when society was quick to pigeonhole you. What you wore and consumed would segment you. It was before everything changed. It was pre-internet.
like society the internet hadn't come and just been like, pushed it all together and been like, hey, mix it up, so.
The great takeaway from skateboarding was the sense of trying. It meant putting aside ego. You attempted new things, never worrying about the outcomes early on. But even before diving in headfirst, Jon was incredibly relaxed. It was never a priority to set goals for himself.
That allows for a lot of like spontaneity and like a lot of like originality, because it's like if there is no goal, because like the goals always come later, right? Like once you master something, then you can start being like, okay, like I can set a goal. But in the beginning, it's like it's very weird for me to be like, like even right now, like with going to like when I left Vans just to design bags, like I didn't set out to be the world's best bag designer. Like what I wanted to do was trying to be like, okay, can I explore a different side of like creating product? You know what I mean? Now I'm going to take everything that I learned from footwear and roll it into that, but it's like the goal after you kind of master your craft would probably be to be like, okay, like now that I've kind of mastered it, now I could kind of like set a goal of being like, okay, I really want to be like this or that. But in the beginning, it's kind of like it'd be. I mean, for me, I'd always think it'd be foolish to be like, well, I'm going to be this, and you're like,
Right.
dude, I don't even know what what this even means. Like,
Just as Jon had become a respectable photographer, he began to embrace this perspective.
I was never worried about sucking because I knew I'd suck. I mean, I did suck as a skateboarder, and eventually I got good. Like, so I knew if I picked up the
Removing
camera,
that sense of
but if you
ego
don't start,
helped
you're
Jon
not
manage his
always sucking, you know what I mean? So
expectations.
for me, it was just
He knew
like,
that the
you know,
very act of starting was a
okay,
small
you know what,
victory
like, I'm
in and of
okay with,
itself.
not knowing what I'm doing, because it's like, eventually I'll get it. Like, I know I'll learn it, and I've always kind of felt like that. Like, that's always kind of been my design philosophy, or not even design, but life philosophy. It's just kind of like, all right, cool.
This personality of exploration expanded into many other facets of Jon's life. In the past, fashion was arguably a much stronger cultural identifier. Now, not so much. You no longer need to be rooted to one identity in fashion. It's allowed to have different points of view.
I think that, I mean, that's the thing right now that I really enjoy, is that, like, the surprise of when you meet people now and you don't know what they're about, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you meet them and they might not dress like you or look like you, and you could have a conversation where you have everything in common. And, you know, the beauty of that is that there's not as much, like, ignorance or kind of, like, segregation, like, because it's like, you know, you never know what someone's into. And I think there's a beauty of that, because, like, I think for a long time we had to dress a certain way to kind of portray, like, hey, look what I'm into.
Right.
You know, don't get me wrong.
Like, this is who I am.
Yeah, like, you know, like, check me out. Like, okay, I'm part of your little tribe, you know, because it really is. Like, it's about a tribe, you know, but it's changed quite a bit. And, you know, to be honest with you, it's like, I love to be, I'm glad that I got to be before the internet, and I'm really glad to be a part of it, because, you know, like, you
Offline
society
and online
will always change. And
That's
you
a
don't
unique
wanna be,
experience for
me,
some who lived in both eras. It has a particular influence on how you appropriate experiences and relationships.
Now they don't have jobs, you know. And to me, it's kind of like you either conform to, like, you conform or be a part of society, or society kind of like passes you by.
Jon's acceptance of new opportunities and tinkering with them would slowly become an important tool in his arsenal. He quickly improved as a designer, thanks to a macroscopic view of the world. It was one that included both his own interests and the curiosity for other cultures.
You know, the beauty of, like, kind of like what I like about design is it's that, like, I'm a real good, like, DJ as far as, like, taking bits and pieces of, like, what's happening in society, and, like, kind of like what's cool, or maybe what I think might be cool that's not cool, and taking it and piecing it together, you know? Because I think it's not, are you going to reinvent a shoe? No, because the foot doesn't change. Like, are you really going to reinvent a t-shirt? Like, t-shirt, clothing, like, think about it. Like, a t-shirt or a button-up, pants, because the human body doesn't change, it's like, you still have to work around the general form, right? Yeah. Like, you're moving pockets and seams and panels, like.
Jon concedes that what he designs doesn't allow for the same level of innovation, but that's where his skills in creating context come into play. The human anatomy evolves at such a slow pace, you need to find a new way of offering relevance.
I think it's more about the presentation, right? It's more about, like, how do you redefine the product that, like, in a way where they look at something and they're like, wow, you know what? It's just enough different where I'm kind of, like, interested again, you know? It's not, like, you're not going to, I don't think you're going to blow anyone's mind. Like, I mean, like, were you blown away by the Apple Watch?
No, not really.
Did it blow your mind? No. You know, like, it didn't, right? It's not like back in the day when they're like, they invented a car and no one had seen the car, and they're like, holy shit, there's a car. You know, like, oh, hey, here's a light bulb. Boom. Like, you know, we haven't had, you know.
He goes on to explain an experience with Odd Future at Supreme LA. The rawness and purity of Odd Future's vision was in a similar vein to Jon's past. But now Jon has something that works alongside that edginess and opinion. Experience. It's the experience that allows him to more effectively communicate his message, whether that be in design or interacting with those around him.
I had to be anti-everything, and I had to be super antisocial and, like, be push back against like what I saw when I was young. And like that's your job as a young person, right? Like I love when I meet a kid that's like an absolute maniac, right? Like crazy, like, you know what I mean? Doesn't give a fuck, doing what they want to do.
Wait, are we filming?
Yeah, let's film.
What's your name? You look like you run shit.
I'm running this shit.
That's tight.
So we need you to start focusing and
What the fuck is focus?
You know, Odd Future, right? Like I met like all those kids because like my brother-in-law runs Supreme, right? So I met those kids before they like became like
What they are.
Odd Future, whatever. Like they were just some fucking weird kids that like made beats and like weird tapes, like weird fucking tapes. It's Supreme, you know? And I remember that when I met them, I was like, man, these kids are the coolest. Like, the music's horrible. I don't like it.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't mean that like it's not horrible now, but it was like, it was crazy. Like they were talking about like chopping off heads and like I had no, like I felt old, right? And so, but you know, we were skateboarding in Supreme and like, you know, it's like I was wearing some crazy boots and like, it was just fun because it was like, they weren't afraid to make fun of me. Like I wasn't afraid to have fun with them. And like, you could tell that there was that attitude of being like, they were doing something on their own. It was super pure. It was super raw. And it's like, it worked. I mean, look at that. They blew up. And it's like, but I think that that's youth's position, right? You have to kind of come out swinging and you have to have that
Right.
because it's like, if you don't have that, like you can't, like I have the wisdom to be where I'm at, but it's like, I had to go through all this anti-everything in order to be like, to peel the layers back and be like, okay, that's okay. Like, this is okay.
Sure.
But it's, I think it's why I do good product is because I still, like when it comes to making things, like I have a really gnarly opinion of like what I think is right and what I think is wrong and like what I think the brand stands for and what I don't think the brand stands for. And like, if you ask anybody that's ever worked with me or for me, like they'll tell you, like I'll fight to the death on like certain ideas, you know? Now I know like, cause I've gotten older, I've definitely backed off on like, you know, knowing to pick my battles, but it's like, you know, I think that spirit of like punk and that spirit of like do it yourself was just kind of like, you know, yeah, you're supposed to have an opinion. Right. You need to have an opinion. Now, it doesn't mean that other opinions aren't right. Like, dude, sure. I'm open, dude. Like, I am willing to take like the way that I work.
During his time at Vans, he helped launch Vans Syndicate, a line dedicated to small numbers and indie skate shops. Every step of the way, new design categories have represented different points in his life.
Syndicate was started based on like being like a young, angry punk skater, right? Like everybody that we worked with was like a heavyweight in skateboarding. It was all about the like underdog. It was all about the big like fuck you to the man, you know? And is as a human being, it was like, you know, I look at different categories that I've worked on and it's like they were a way to kind of like either work through or like be a reflection of like different times in my life, you know? And as I've gotten older, you know, it's like that youth and that anger and a lot of that stuff has just kind of faded off because it's like the more I met people and the more I'd get you know, the more, every time I travel and I meet someone new, they'd shine light on something and I'd be like, man, like my old view is pretty ignorant. Like, wow, weird. Like,
it's once again this openness to experiences that has shaped and formed Jon's outlook. Everything has been a slow accumulation. New thoughts, new meetings, and new ideas that create a constantly dynamic approach to life and design. What was once glanced over or appeared whack and uncool suddenly took on a new definition. Jon refers to his love of Nashville and country.
Well, but then again, it's like I went out there and it's like I never realized that country was punk. Yeah. Okay, you walk into a city, everyone's wearing normal clothes, and you walk in with a bolo tie, a freaking giant hat, cowboy boots on. You are a freaking maniac. You are a total punker, right? Yeah. And there's a beauty in the fact that, like, as you get older, you could see things from a different angle and be like, okay, cool. Like, I didn't get it, but now I do. And so now it's like I could be like, all right, you know, Johnny Cash and like, you know, young Elvis and all this kind of stuff. It's like.
So how does one take a perspective and apply it professionally? Jon starts to narrow in on what it all means. This perspective has broad sweeping benefits in the Tumblr age.
You know, there's a lot of people doing a lot of cool things. And by looking at all these different things, it
From
allows
John's
you to
perspective,
kind of look
you have to
at
be
what you
careful
make
not to
a
get
little
sucked
bit
into the
broader, right? Because it's like,
influences
if I
of the
just looked
internet.
at, like, websites,
The ease of accessibility
and made product
means
that I
that
just
many find the
saw on
same
websites,
inspirations.
well, then I could tell you, like,
It also pushes people to
see a lot of
recreate what's
brands
safe
do that,
and what
you know? You're
works,
kind of like, okay,
but not something
like,
new
everyone's
and
looking
original.
at the same crap. Same stuff. So the problem is that, like, because you're looking at it, you're influenced by it, right? And like, dude, I'm influenced by it just the same. I'm not saying I'm above it by any means. Like, I look at all the like streetwear websites and the high fashion, but it's like I have a lot of interests that are.
John aims to balance the old and the new. His interest in the past influences his design language of the present. Knowledge, experience, and a good point of view can turn someone who's a great cultural asset into an angry old man. John spoke with good friend, former Supreme designer, and OAMC founder Luke Mayer. They both came to the conclusion that they should be the difference makers in culture.
You know, everything sucks, like the kids today, blah, blah, blah. Not Luke and I, but this is what, you know, a lot of people like that have
John
been in this
speaks
for
with
a while.
great
That's what they
disdain
say.
about all the old school haters and their negative vibes.
They were just like, I fucking hated people like you when I was a kid, right? Because people told me punk was dead. Punk was dead when I was a kid, right? But like, it was still cool, right? Like, I mean, it was still like, no one was listening to punk, and they were like, dude, fuck, you're a kook, man. Fucking punk's dead, dude. Punk was dead before, and it's like in the 80s. This is like 85, and they're like, fucking punk's dead, you suck, and you're like, you know what? One day I will never be you because I fucking hate you.
Yeah.
For your like for doing that. And so like for me, we were talking about that, and you know, he was saying that like, you know, Luke at the time was at Supreme, and like I was at Vans, and like, you know, our friend like Chris Gibbs is running Union, and like, you know, we have like friends all over the place, you know, and
so John and a legion of pioneers looked inward. If culture and landscape lacked substance, they wanted to take the responsibility to make it better.
You know, we have like friends all over the place, you know, and you know, Paul Middleman at that time was running Stussy, and like we were saying that like if things suck, it's on us. Right. Okay? Like if things suck, literally you only have to the farthest you have to look is in the mirror. Yeah. To know why things suck. And like that was the thing that when he said that, I was like, wow, yeah, you know what I mean? It's like, what a cool philosophy. It's like, hey, listen, like, if things aren't cool, like, and you're the person that's saying everything that sucks, it's like, you're the only the person that's saying things suck is a person that's, like, most of the time defining culture.
Besides playing their part, they also took it upon themselves to ensure a level of quality and to push culture forward. As our conversation comes to a close, John's adamant that, while we aren't always given all the resources, the beauty of it lies in making the most of what we have through love and passion.
Like one piece of that like pie of like, hey, like we're going to play our part. And, you know, that's the beauty, I think, of looking at design now for me and like the people that like I really admire is that you kind of look at it and you're like, all right, yeah, you know what? Like, I'm not going to make shitty things. Like, I'm going to do the best that I can. And it doesn't mean that everything I make is dope or great, but it's like we're doing the best that we have. The same way that I bumbled into photography, I'm bumbling my way through design. But like, there's 100% love and dedication to it, and it's like authentic. And there's never a product that I drop that I wouldn't get behind and be like,